My name is Claire Whitman, and last night my husband called me useless right in front of his entire family. He said I was nothing more than a parasite who didn't deserve to live under his roof. He sat there in his pressed navy suit, the light catching the gold on his cufflinks while his brother and parents looked on. Then, as if the sting of his words weren't enough, he leaned back in his chair and bragged about the $1 million deal he and his brother were closing. Everyone raised their glasses in a toast to his genius while my own cheeks burned hot with shame. But I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. Instead, I smiled, quietly, sipped my wine, and waited. Because I knew something none of them knew. And this morning, as my phone buzzed over and over with 35 missed calls from my husband, I knew the wait had been worth it. The night had started with polite smiles, the kind that never reached my husband's eyes anymore. David had invited his whole family over for dinner, his parents, his brother Mark, and Mark's wife, Lillian. The Whitmans were a dynasty in their own minds, their wealth passed down through real estate and investment portfolios that seemed to swell every time the market sneezed. I had spent the afternoon preparing. I set the table with china that wasn't mine, polished silver I'd never chosen, and cooked a roast that David would later claim was under-seasoned no matter what anyone else thought. I was used to it, the little dismissals, the subtle ways he made sure I never forgot my place. My place in his eyes was beneath him. The conversation over dinner was the same as always: money deals, vacations that cost more than my annual teaching salary back when I worked before David convinced me to quit. "What's the point?" he'd said. "My wife doesn't need to work. Just take care of the house." It sounded generous at the time, but what he meant was, stay small, stay dependent, stay quiet. When Mark asked David how the negotiations were going with the new investors, David's face lit up like a boy unwrapping a Christmas present. He launched into a speech about risk profiles, returns, and international markets, peppering his words with numbers that seemed to impress everyone but me. And of course, David said, raising his glass with a smirk, once this deal closes, we'll be pulling in 7 figures. Mark and I are unstoppable together. Meanwhile, his eyes slid to me, cold and sharp. Meanwhile, Claire here is still trying to figure out how to manage a grocery list. The table erupted in laughter. His mother, a woman who had never liked me, covered her mouth in mock shock. Lillian's smile was tight, pitying, as though she wanted to say something but wouldn't dare. And really, David added, his voice swelling with the self-satisfaction of a man who thought cruelty was wit. She should be grateful to even be sitting in this house. A woman who contributes nothing shouldn't expect a roof over her head. There it was. The dagger he'd been sharpening for months now, driven cleanly into my chest in front of everyone I was supposed to call family. I glanced at my wine glass, the deep red liquid swirling under the low light. My heart thudded against my ribs, but outwardly, I didn't react. I lifted the glass, took a slow sip, and let the silence stretch. The smile on my lips wasn't for David or for his family. It was for myself. Because he didn't know what I had already set in motion. Later that night, as the family toasted again to the $1 million deal, I excused myself, pretending to check on dessert. I stood in the kitchen alone, breathing in the scent of baked apples and cinnamon, and whispered to myself, just a little longer. When David finally dismissed his guests with booming laughter, he was too drunk on ego to notice me slipping into the guest room with my phone, checking for the message I knew would come. And it did. One single text from a number saved under Helen PTA, a name David would never question because he didn't care enough to ask. The message was simple: everything's ready. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, returned to the dining room, and smiled at David as though nothing in the world was amiss. Because tomorrow, everything he thought he controlled would start to unravel. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the drapes like pale ribbons across the hardwood floor. David was still asleep, sprawled across the bed like a conqueror after battle, his snores rattling against the silence. His phone lay on the nightstand, the screen lighting up occasionally with emails from Mark and their lawyer. Deals, meetings, conferences. His world was busy, important, full of urgency. My world, according to him, was empty. But I had learned to live in the quiet, to work beneath his radar, to let him underestimate me until the underestimation became armor. I padded into the kitchen in bare feet, the marble floor cool against my skin. The coffee machine hissed, filling the air with a smell I used to love, but had grown to associate with David's sharp critiques. He'd claim the beans weren't ground finely enough, or that the water wasn't hot enough, as though brewing coffee were a test I was destined to fail. But this morning I brewed it just for me. One perfect cup made the way I liked it, strong, slightly bitter with a spoonful of sugar. I carried it to the patio where the world beyond the Whitman estate still felt real. The street was quiet, lined with maples just beginning to burn gold in the autumn air. A jogger passed by, earbuds in, oblivious to the war that simmered inside this house. I checked my phone again. 35 missed calls, all from David. He must have discovered something already. Maybe the first domino had tipped. I thought back to the night I'd made my decision months earlier. It wasn't one moment, but dozens strung together like beads on a necklace of humiliation. David's constant reminders that I was lucky to have him. The way he'd joke at parties that my greatest accomplishment was not burning toast. The subtle pressure to cut ties with friends who didn't fit the Whitman mold. And the final straw, the night he sneered at me in front of Mark, saying Claire couldn't survive 5 minutes without me. That night, lying awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling while David snored beside me, I whispered into the silence, "Watch me." The next morning, I began my quiet resistance. I reconnected with Sarah, an old friend from college who now worked as a financial investigator. Our lunches were casual, hidden under the guise of catching up, but each meeting layered me with knowledge I hadn't possessed before. She taught me how to read financial statements, how to trace transactions that weren't where they were supposed to be, how to spot the red flags in David's firm that even his clients hadn't noticed yet. "You're telling me he funnels money through shell companies," I'd whispered once over coffee, my pulse quickening. Sarah had given me a long, steady look. "Claire, I'm telling you, he's not as brilliant as he thinks he is. Men like him always leave a trail. You just have to know where to look." So I looked, slowly, carefully. While David spent evenings bragging about his upcoming deal, I spent mine poring over files he left carelessly in his study. He believed his world was too complicated for me to understand, that words like equity and derivatives would confuse me. But I learned. I scribbled notes, photographed documents, and tucked them into folders labeled innocuous things like recipes and PTA schedules. Every small discovery added a piece to the puzzle, and with Sarah's help, the picture grew clearer. David and Mark weren't just negotiating a $1 million deal. They were shifting money in ways that bent laws, exploiting loopholes that could snap shut at any time. And if the wrong eyes saw it, the Whitmans would crumble. I hadn't planned revenge at first. I just wanted proof. A way to know that I wasn't crazy for feeling the walls tightening around me. But the more David pushed me down, the more determined I became to rise in silence. I started making small changes, opened a bank account in my maiden name, applied for a secured credit card through the local credit union, the kind of step David would never notice because it wasn't flashy enough to cross his radar. Each step was a seed planted in soil he didn't even know existed. And I smiled through it all. At dinners where he mocked me, at parties where he pretended I was a trophy to display, at family gatherings where his parents eyed me with thin-lipped disapproval. Let them all think I was powerless. Let them all laugh. Because power was never in the show. Power was in the patience. The call that had lit the fuse came 2 weeks ago. Sarah's voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the current of excitement beneath it. "Claire, the SEC has been circling firms like David's. If what you've shown me checks out, they'll be interested. Are you ready?" I'd swallowed hard, staring out the window at the garden David never stepped foot in. I've been ready for months. The text from Helen PTA last night had only confirmed it. By the time David was raising his glass in drunken triumph, the first threads were already being pulled. This morning, sipping coffee on the patio, I let myself feel the weight of what was coming. David would rage, he would deny, he would blame me as he always did. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. For the first time, he needed me more than I needed him. Inside, I heard his phone vibrate again, louder this time, insistent. 36, 37, 38 missed calls. I set down my empty cup, my lips curving into a quiet smile. Let him squirm. The silence I'd endured for years was finally speaking louder than his voice ever could. By the time David finally woke that morning, the cracks had already begun to spread. I heard him stirring upstairs, heavy footsteps across the floorboards, the impatient slam of the closet door drawers yanked open. When he appeared in the kitchen, his jaw was tight, his tie knotted unevenly. He didn't look at me right away. Instead, he grabbed his phone from the counter, scrolling through the avalanche of missed calls and messages with a scowl that deepened by the second. "What the hell is going on?" His voice was sharp-clipped. I looked up from my coffee with practiced calm. "Good morning to you too." He didn't even blink at the sarcasm. His eyes darted across the screen, his thumb moving quickly. "Mark says we need to meet at the office immediately. Something about an inquiry." He looked at me, then suspicion flickering in his gaze. "Did you touch any of my files?" I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "Files? Why would I touch your work stuff?" His eyes narrowed, but he didn't press. Not yet. Instead, he tore a slice of toast from the plate I'd set out, chewing like it had personally offended him. He was jittery, off balance in a way I'd never seen. David usually moved with the swagger of a man convinced the world existed to applaud him, but that morning he looked like someone waiting for a guillotine to drop. I studied him quietly, tucking away every detail. His cufflinks weren't polished, his hair usually styled with meticulous precision stuck up at odd angles. The arrogance in his posture had wilted into something brittle. The cracks were appearing, and I was savoring every one. David stormed out 20 minutes later, muttering about idiot regulators and Mark screwing up the paperwork. His Audi peeled out of the driveway, tires screeching against asphalt. I waited until the sound faded, then exhaled. My hands trembled around the coffee cup, though not from fear, from release. For years, I'd lived in a state of bracing, waiting for his next cutting remark, his next dismissal. Now, for the first time, he was the one bracing. I cleaned the kitchen slowly, methodically, grounding myself in the ordinary. The smell of toast, the scrape of the butter knife, the cool marble under my palm. Ordinary things that reminded me I wasn't just the woman David tried to shrink. I was still Claire, the teacher, the friend, the woman who once dreamed of writing children's books and planting her own garden. Dreams David had mocked as cute little hobbies. My phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "It's starting. Check the news." I opened the link. My breath caught. A headline splashed across the business section of the local paper: SEC launches inquiry into Whitman Brothers investments. The article was brief, careful, with language allegations, preliminary investigation, but the seed was planted. The Whitman name was in print, not as a family of brilliance and wealth, but under suspicion. I scrolled through the comments beneath the article. Anonymous voices speculating about shady dealings, greedy men, corrupt firms. People who once envied the Whitmans were already circling like vultures. I pressed a hand against my chest, steadying myself. It was happening faster than I expected. By noon, David had called 7 times. I let each one go to voicemail. His messages grew more frantic with every hour. "Claire, answer the damn phone. They're blowing this out of proportion. I need you to back me up if anyone calls. Just tell them you don't know anything. Don't be stupid, Claire. You think you can survive without me? You can't." That last one made me laugh, sharp and quiet. because for once he wasn't sure. When the doorbell rang, I startled. My heart raced as I approached, but it wasn't David. It was Henry, the delivery man who handled most of our packages. He tipped his cap politely. "Morning, Mrs. Whitman. Got something here for you. Signature required." I frowned, taking the clipboard. The package was small, plain, addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a simple flash drive and a folded note. "Thought you might want a copy. H." My stomach flipped. Henry wasn't just a delivery man. He was also a part-time waiter at the restaurant where David had humiliated me the night before. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. My screen filled with crystal-clear footage, David sneering, calling me useless, bragging about his $1 million deal while his family laughed along. Every word, every smirk captured by the restaurant's cameras. Proof, not just of his cruelty but of his arrogance. I leaned back in my chair, the corners of my mouth curling upward. David had always believed in appearances, and now appearances were going to bury him. The phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't David. It was Lillian. "Claire," she whispered when I answered, her voice trembling. "Have you seen the news? Mark says everything's under control, but I don't believe him." "What's happening?" I hesitated, listening to the fear threading her tone. For years, Lillian had sat in silence while David mocked me, while Mark dismissed me. Now she was calling me for answers. "I don't know," I said softly, though my eyes lingered on the flash drive in my laptop. "But maybe you should start asking Mark the questions you've been too afraid to ask." Silence stretched on the line, heavy with unspoken truths. Then quietly, "Be careful, Claire. Men like them, they don't go down easy." The call ended. I sat in the quiet house, sunlight shifting across the floor as the day wore on. The cracks were widening, spreading through David's life like fractures in glass. And I was the one holding the hammer. By the time dusk rolled in that evening, David's perfect world had already begun to unravel. I knew it the second his car screeched into the driveway, gravel spitting under his tires. He slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows, his footsteps pounding up the porch like thunder. When the front door burst open, David's face was flushed, his tie yanked loose, sweat shining at his temples. He looked less like the polished investment partner he fancied himself, and more like a man being chased. "Claire!" he barked, his voice cracking at the edges. "Where's my laptop? Tell me you didn't touch anything in my office." I set my wine glass down on the coffee table with deliberate calm. "Your laptop's right where you left it, David." "Why?" He paced the living room like a caged animal, tugging at his collar. "Because the SEC just walked into our office today. They froze 2 of our accounts. Do you understand what that means? Millions gone? I've been on the phone all day trying to keep clients from pulling out." I raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "That sounds stressful." His head whipped toward me, eyes sharp. "Stressful, Claire? This is catastrophic. If they dig deep enough, they'll twist everything. They'll make it look like fraud. Mark's already panicking." He ran a hand through his hair, the motion frantic. "I need you to tell me exactly who you've been talking to." For a moment, I let the silence sit between us. He wanted to intimidate me, to make me confess something, anything. But I just crossed my legs, slowly resting my hands on my knee, the way I'd seen women of power do in movies. "I've been talking to Sarah about book club," I said evenly. "And Lillian called earlier. She seemed worried." "That's it." David stared at me, his breathing ragged. He didn't believe me, but he couldn't prove otherwise. We ate dinner in near silence, if you could call it dinner. He pushed food around his plate, barely touching it, his phone buzzing every 5 minutes. Each time his expression grew darker. "Clients," he muttered. "Everyone's spooked. They're like sheep. One headline and suddenly no one trusts you." I cut a piece of roast and chewed slowly, watching him unravel. For years he'd gloated at these same dinners, bragging about portfolios, laughing at my little teacher salary, reminding me that without him, I'd have nothing. But now his empire was cracking, and all I had to do was sit quietly and watch. Later that night, he cornered me in the hallway. His eyes were bloodshot, his breath hot with whiskey. "You've been distant," he accused. "Don't think I haven't noticed." Smirking at me like you know something. "If you're working against me, Claire, if you've said anything, you'll regret it." I met his gaze steadily, heart hammering but face calm. "I don't need to work against you, David. You're doing a fine job destroying yourself." His nostrils flared, a muscle in his jaw twitching. For a second I thought he might strike me. But then he shoved past, storming into his office and slamming the door. I stood there in the hallway, my grandmother's emerald earrings brushing against my neck, and whispered to myself, "He's scared. He should be." The next morning brought the real turning point. I was halfway through my coffee when my phone buzzed again, this time, not from Sarah, not from Lillian, but from an unknown number. A voicemail. I pressed play, and the voice made my skin prickle. "Mrs. Whitman, this is Agent Morales with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We'd like to schedule a time to ask you a few questions regarding your husband's activities. Please call us back at your earliest convenience." I froze, cup suspended midair. Then slowly I set it down. It was happening. They weren't just circling David anymore, they were coming to me. And I was ready. By noon, news of the investigation had spread beyond the business pages. It was on the evening broadcast. A polished anchorwoman read David's name aloud as footage played of suited agents carrying boxes out of his downtown office. "Sources say the investigation involves potential mismanagement of client funds by Whitman Brothers Investments," the anchor intoned. Neither David nor Mark Whitman could be reached for comment. I sat on the couch watching the words scroll across the ticker: allegations of fraud, SEC investigation, frozen assets. David burst into the living room halfway through the segment, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. He froze when he saw the screen. For once he had no clever remark, no sneer, no deflection. Just silence. Then he turned on me. "Don't you dare talk to them," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You'll keep your mouth shut, Claire. You hear me? You don't know anything, and that's exactly what you'll tell them." I rose slowly, meeting him eye to eye. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't waver. "I know enough," I said. For the first time, his face cracked just for a second, a flicker of panic breaking through. That night, as he collapsed into bed, tossing and turning with restless nightmares, I stood by the window, phone in hand. Sarah's message glowed on the screen. "Tomorrow it all comes out." I glanced back at David, his once proud figure curled like a child in the sheets. The mighty man who'd called me useless, a parasite, a woman who didn't deserve his house, was trembling in his sleep. And for the first time in years, I felt powerful. Because the turning point had come, and it was only the beginning. By dawn, the unraveling was in full swing. I woke not to the alarm, but to the sound of David cursing downstairs. His voice carried through the vents sharp, frantic bursts of anger. The unmistakable crash of glass followed. I slipped into my robe and padded down the hallway, my bare feet whispering against the hardwood. In the kitchen, he stood in the wreckage of a shattered tumbler whiskey, pooling across the marble like a stain of desperation. His phone was clutched in his hand, the screen glowing with missed calls and unread messages. "They froze the rest of our accounts," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "All of them. We're finished." He looked up, eyes bloodshot, skin ashen. "Do you understand what this means, Claire? They've killed us. Years of work gone overnight." I leaned against the doorway, arms folded. "Maybe it wasn't the SEC that killed you. Maybe it was greed." His jaw clenched. He wanted to retort, to crush me with some cutting remark. But he didn't. He just turned away, shoulders heaving, the weight of his collapsing empire pressing down. By mid-morning, the house phone one David insisted we keep for appearances rang shrill. I answered before he could snatch it. "Claire." It was his mother, her voice trembling with a mixture of outrage and fear. "What is happening? Do you know what people are saying? Your husband has dragged this family's name through the mud." I almost laughed. For years she'd tolerated his arrogance, even encouraged it. Now the tide was shifting. "I only know what I've seen on the news," I said evenly, "but maybe you should be asking David instead of me." She sputtered, scandalized, before slamming the line dead. I placed the receiver gently back, savoring the role reversal. Not half an hour later, another call, this time Lillian. "Claire," she whispered urgently. "Mark's furious. He says David messed everything up, that this was supposed to be airtight. He's talking about distancing himself publicly." I closed my eyes, letting her words sink in. The Whitman brothers, always united, always untouchable, crumbling into finger-pointing and betrayal. "Be careful, Lillian," I murmured. "When men like that start drowning, they'll pull anyone down with them." The unraveling accelerated. By noon, David's name was plastered across every local outlet. Phrases like potential wire fraud and embezzlement of client funds were repeated so often they lost their sting for me, though each one seemed to pierce him like a blade. The phone buzzed non-stop. Some calls he answered, others he let ring until voicemail caught the chaos. I heard fragments of conversations. "No, that's not how it happened. I'll fix this. Just give me time. Mark, you can't pin this on me." But the more he tried to control the narrative, the faster it slipped through his fingers. At 3 o'clock sharp, there was a knock at the door. Not the polite rap of a neighbor, but the firm, rhythmic knock of authority. David froze, color draining from his face. "Don't answer that," he hissed. But I already was. Standing on the porch were 2 men and 1 woman, all in dark suits, badges clipped neatly to their jackets. "Mrs. Whitman," the woman asked, her tone professional, but not unkind. "We'd like to speak with you if we may." Behind me, David's voice thundered, "She has nothing to say." But my voice was calm. "Of course. Come in." They sat up at the dining table, the same one where David had humiliated me just nights before. Now, instead of laughter and toasts, there were notepads, recorders, and the scratch of pens across paper. David paced like a caged animal, barking protests. "This is absurd. Claire doesn't know anything. She's a housewife. She can't help you." But they ignored him. Their eyes were on me. "Mrs. Whitman," Agent Morales began, "we understand you may have been present during conversations or seen documents related to your husband's business dealings. We want you to feel safe sharing anything you know." My gaze drifted to David. His fists were clenched, veins bulging in his neck, rage simmering just beneath his skin. And then, for the first time in years, I spoke without fear. "I've seen enough," I said softly, "and I can help." The agents leaned forward. David's face contorted red with fury. "You traitor! After everything I've given you, you'd sell me out." I met his rage with quiet steel. "You didn't give me anything, David. You tried to take everything. There's a difference." That evening, after the agents left with their notes and assurances, the house felt different. Lighter, almost. David sat slumped in his office chair, staring blankly at the darkened computer screen. The mighty man reduced to a husk. "You think this makes you powerful, Claire?" His voice was hoarse, bitter. "You think anyone cares about you without my name attached?" I walked to the doorway, resting my hand on the frame. "I don't need your name anymore," I said. "All I need is the truth. And that's finally on my side." He laughed, then a hollow, joyless sound. "The truth won't save you when I'm gone. When this house is gone. When everything you cling to vanishes." But he was wrong. Because I'd already started building a life that wasn't tied to his marble countertops, his imported wine, his illusions of grandeur. The unraveling wasn't mine, it was his. And I was finally free enough to watch it burn. The fall wasn't sudden. It came in pieces, each one cutting away another layer of David's carefully crafted image until nothing remained but a hollow man. The morning after the agents visited, the story hit the national news. Not just local business pages or the evening broadcast, but national outlets with glossy anchors and polished graphics. "Whitman Brothers investments under federal investigation." David's face, once the symbol of wealth and confidence, was plastered across every screen in our living room. They replayed footage of him walking briskly into his office, lips pressed into a grim line, cameras flashing all around. They dissected his past deals, speculated on offshore accounts, even interviewed former clients who suddenly remembered every red flag they'd ignored. I sat on the sofa, tea in hand, watching it all unfold. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same house where he'd mocked me, called me useless, was now the stage where his empire collapsed. By noon, his parents arrived unannounced. His mother swept into the foyer like a storm cloud, pearls clutched tight at her throat. "David," she hissed, "what have you done to this family?" His father trailed behind, face stern disappointment etched in every line. David tried to defend himself. "It's exaggerated. The press is blowing it out of proportion." "Mark. Don't you dare blame Mark," his father snapped. "He says you're the one who pushed for these schemes." I lingered in the hallway unseen, listening to the cracks widen. For years, his parents had doted on him, enabling his arrogance, excusing every slight. Now their golden boy was tarnished. And me, I was invisible again. But this time, invisibility was power. That evening, Lillian called once more. Her voice was shaky, brittle. "Claire, I don't know what to do. Mark is furious. He says David ruined everything. He's already talking to lawyers about protecting himself. He might even testify." The Whitman brothers, once united in smug confidence, were now turning on each other like cornered dogs. "You should protect yourself, Lillian," I said gently. "Mark won't think twice about sacrificing you if it saves him." There was silence. Then a whisper. "Be careful, Claire. David's dangerous when he feels cornered." She was right. That night, David confronted me in the kitchen. His tie hung loose. His shirt wrinkled, his eyes red from too many drinks. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he sneered, stepping closer, sitting back, watching me fall. "You think you're better than me now?" I held his gaze, though my pulse thundered in my ears. "No, David. I don't think I'm better. I just know I'm not useless." His hand twitched as though he wanted to strike me, but then he froze. Maybe he remembered the agents, the headlines, the eyes already watching him. He stepped back, fists clenched at his sides, seething. "You'll regret this. When I'm gone and you've got nothing, you'll regret every word." But I wouldn't, because I already had everything I needed. The real fall came 2 days later. We were sitting in the living room, the air thick with tension, when his phone rang. He answered eagerly, only for the color to drain from his face. "What do you mean?" "Indicted." His voice cracked. "No. There's been a mistake. No. No, listen to me." He slammed the phone down, chest-heaving, eyes wild. "They're charging me. Do you understand? They're actually charging me." I leaned back on the sofa, arms folded. Then I guess the truth finally caught up. The fury in his eyes was something I'll never forget. He looked at me like I was the rope that had tightened around his neck. But then, for the first time, there was fear beneath the rage. That night, as news of the indictment spread, calls stopped coming. Friends who once flocked to our parties vanished. Clients who once praised his genius condemned him. Even his parents refused to return his calls. He was alone. And in that loneliness, he unraveled completely. Pacing the halls at 2 a.m., muttering to himself, slamming doors, hurling glasses against walls. At one point, he stood in the doorway of our bedroom, eyes glazed, whispering, "If I go down, Claire, I'll take you with me." But his threats no longer held weight, because now the law was stronger than his words. The morning after he left in handcuffs, I stood at the window watching as 2 federal agents escorted him to the waiting car. Cameras flashed at the end of the driveway. Neighbors lingered on sidewalks, pretending to walk their dogs while drinking in the spectacle. David kept his head down, jaw clenched, but I saw it, the humiliation, the realization that he was no longer untouchable. When the car pulled away, silence settled over the house. For the first time in years, the silence felt like freedom. I turned back inside, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat in the same spot where I'd once endured his insults. This time I raised my glass, not to him, not to his downfall, but to myself. To surviving, to waiting, to finally watching justice fall where it belonged. The house was quiet after David left. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was soft, almost tender, like a blanket wrapped around me. I walked from room to room, taking in the marble countertops, the grand staircase, the walls lined with art David had chosen, not because he loved it, but because it made a statement. Everything in that house had been selected for appearances, for show, for the image of wealth and control. But none of it mattered anymore. Within weeks, the government seized most of David's assets. The bank accounts he'd bragged about were drained, the cars repossessed, the estate frozen. Lawyers called me, their voices sharp, wanting to know what I knew, what I had seen. But thanks to Sarah and Marjorie's guidance, I had already prepared everything. My statements were clear, concise, backed by documents and recordings. David's empire was ashes, and I stood outside the smoke. The divorce was brutal, but it was also inevitable. He tried to fight me even from behind bars. He claimed I was complicit, that I knew everything, that I was trying to save myself by throwing him to the wolves. But the morality clause in our prenuptial agreement became my sword and shield. With proof of his crimes and recordings of his public humiliation, the court sided with me. I walked away, not just with my freedom, but with enough financial security to build a life of my own. And I did. My new home wasn't a mansion. It wasn't marble and glass. It wasn't sprawling acres or imported chandeliers. It was a modest 2-story house on a quiet street with a little garden out back, where I planted tulips and lavender. For the first time in years, I could open the windows and let the breeze in without worrying about appearances. I returned to work at the library, the place where I had always felt most alive. Children ran up to me with picture books, their faces glowing with excitement, their laughter echoing off the walls. To them, I wasn't useless. I was the woman who read them stories, who taught them how to find magic between the pages, who reminded them that their voices mattered. And every time a child hugged me or a parent thanked me, I thought back to that night at the Whitman dinner table. David's voice, cruel and arrogant, declaring me a parasite. And I smiled, because he had been wrong all along. Lillian called me once after the trial. Her voice was soft, fragile. "I don't know how you did it, Claire," she whispered. "How you kept your strength." I thought for a long moment before answering. I didn't feel strong, I admitted. Not for a long time. But sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's just surviving long enough to let the truth do the talking. She cried quietly on the other end, and for the first time I felt no anger toward her. She had been trapped too in her own way. David, meanwhile, became a ghost. His name appeared occasionally in the paper's updates on his trial, whispers about a possible plea deal. But the man who once strutted through life with his chest puffed out was now reduced to mugshots and speculation. His calls to me stopped long ago. Every now and then, though, I'd glance at my phone, and there it would be, a missed call from an unknown number, one I knew was his. I never answered, because I didn't need to hear his voice to know the truth. Months later, I hosted a small dinner at my new home. Friends from the library gathered around the table, the air warm with laughter and the scent of roasted chicken and fresh bread. We passed plates, shared stories, toasted to small victories and simple joys. And as I looked around that table, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: belonging. Not the brittle belonging of being tolerated by David's family, but the true kind. The kind built on kindness, respect, and love. When I raised my glass, my voice was steady. "To new beginnings," I said. The glasses clinked, the room glowing with warmth. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I stepped out into the garden. The moonlight bathed the tulips in silver, the air cool and fresh. I breathed deeply, letting it fill me. My phone buzzed once more, another missed call. another ghost from the past. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without looking. Because I no longer needed answers. I had already found my own. They called me useless. They said I was nothing. But I learned something along the way. Usefulness isn't measured in dollars or deals or the size of a house. It's measured in the love you give the lives you touch and the quiet strength you carry when the world tries to break you. So if you've ever been told you're not enough, remember this: your worth isn't defined by anyone else's voice. It's yours and yours alone. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs reminding, because sometimes the quietest voices carry the strongest truths.